happy to reflect on that as the bill progresses through each stage.
Was it, there was a, no, not a Good morning and welcome to the 14th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can I remind everyone to switch their electronic devices to silent. This morning we have apologies from Evelyn Tweed and I'd also like to welcome Mark Ruskell. Mark Ruskell. Goodness, I've known you for long enough, Mark. Beg your pardon. Who's going to be joining us as our newest member. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Ariane Burgess for her contribution to the committee's work since the beginning of the parliamentary session. We'll also be joined at some stage this morning by Edward Mountain. We turn to our first item on the agenda, which is consideration of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at Stage 1. At today's meeting, our focus will be on Part 4 of the bill relating to deer management. First, we'll hear from representatives from Nature Scot, and then we'll host a roundtable discussion with 9 stakeholders with an interest in deer management in Scotland. But before we begin, we've been joined with Edward Mountain. Edward, would you like to make any declarations of interest?
Thank you, Convener, and I'm sorry I was slightly late for the meeting. My watch obviously isn't as accurate as yours. I would like just to declare that I've been involved in deer management for over 25 years. I've written deer management plans for various subgroups, including ones in the Cairngorms and ones further north, some of which are still in place. I am involved in deer management at home on the farm, and I've taken a great deal of interest in it. Not all of that is in my register of interest, but as a landowner, I'm sure your committee members will understand that deer need to be controlled, and they are controlled at home. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Mountain. So for the first session, I'd like to welcome to the meeting Donald Fraser, who's the Head of Wildlife Management, and Robbie Kiernan, who's the Director of Green Economy at Nature Scot. We have approximately 60 minutes for this session, and just before we move on, just to make you aware that you don't need to operate your own mics. We've got a gentleman that will do it for you. So I'll kick off with the first question. Section 10 of the bill amends Part 1 of the 1996 Act, which covers Nature Scot's deer functions. Now, the bill updates the aims and purposes of deer management to include the public interest. Additionally, the environment is now something Nature Scot should take account of when carrying out its function. So can I ask, will this change what Nature Scot is already doing on the ground, and how will that affect resources and capacity within Nature Scot?
I'm happy to start, Convener, and thank you. Pleasure to be here. I think in response to the question, this bill really is an opportunity to modernise the deer management legislation, which, when it was first enacted in '59, hasn't really changed significantly, and it's a good opportunity to continue to bring this piece of legislation, I suppose, up to the level we would hope for when we're thinking about nature and climate crisis in Scotland. So the reference to our functions in Part 1 and inclusion of the environment and updating our aims feel to us absolutely the right thing to do. And in defining the public interest, we've always had to take that into account. But you appreciate with the importance of nature and climate now, both in policy terms and the pressures coming to bear through the land use lens, it feels the right time to make sure that the deer legislation, and taking a step back, deer have and will continue to shape our environment for many years to come. It's important that we use the best possible evidence and that references to current challenges are reflected in the legislation.
Thank you. So, do you think it's going to make any effect on the capacity for Nature Scot with the new powers that it will have and having to enforce those?
In terms of Part 1, I don't think this makes a significant difference to how we will administer the legislation. And again, taking a couple of steps back, the deer management system in Scotland is predominantly based on the voluntary system. and this Act provides a mechanism or a range of mechanisms where we might intervene to deliver the public interest. And I think in defining the public interest, we do need to take into account current policy changes and current challenges, but I don't think it will make a significant or material difference to the resources that we currently put into delivering it.
So the public interest is currently undefined. What do you see as the public interest?
Do you want to first go, Donald?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole range in there of public interest, and the 1996 Act kind of set out some of that in a bit of detail, and the natural heritage was referenced to the 1996 Act, but natural heritage is quite a specific term. The environmental aspect of it and the wider biodiversity climate focus that we find ourselves in now obviously broadens out that public interest to a range of areas. And while it's not, and it was explained, I think, at the last committee meeting, that there's a kind of understanding of the public interests that are out there and being delivered on a series of land management spheres. Deer management is obviously part of that, and there's a better understanding of that now.
Can you explain why that definition of public interest is not in the face of the bill? Because there is some attempt to define it in part of the explanatory notes, but it's not likely to change in any great detail. So why is that not on the face of the bill?
I think there are aspects of the public interest which are more clearly defined, Convener, in the fact when you think about the needs of agriculture and forestry, which were the original basis on which deer legislation was introduced to try and protect those interests which were in the public interest at the time. The 1996 Act for the first time introduced the concept of natural heritage quite clearly in the public interest, and then more recent changes beginning to explore wider socio-economic and environmental objectives, which are sometimes quite hard to express on the face of primary legislation. But to give some examples, they might include things like water quality, carbon sequestration, some of the emerging drivers for ensuring that we deal with flood management, with carbon management, which probably are not easy to express in primary legislation, but are really important that they're referenced, and we can then begin to work with the sectors and others to put some colour and substance behind that, which of course the Code of Practice for Deer Management provides a mechanism to help articulate that more robustly.
Given we're going to see things like the climate change plan, biodiversity plans, we've got the Rural Communities Act now that will have different objectives. Those, the public interest might change. Do you think there's a role in secondary legislation for this Parliament to look at the explanatory notes in terms of the public interest, to make sure that the Parliament has oversight of what the public interest might mean and impact on land managers?
Well, I think you've just expressed very clearly that public interests do change over time. And whilst we've got some references on the face of this bill recognising that, I actually think the solution is to be able to pin down those more explicitly in probably secondary legislation and other areas of guidance where there's consensus that things have moved on. I think that's probably as much as I can say in response to that. Convener Donald, I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I think the point here is to be clear about where the mechanisms in the Act, and particularly the regulatory mechanism in the Act, can and will be using that, so that there's a clarity there for the stakeholders, those who are involved in managing deer. So that is important. The mechanism for that, whether that's through primary legislation, secondary legislation, or through development of the deer code in itself, potentially provides a mechanism for that. So there is that clarity there. But that is important to have. Yeah.
So I'm getting from that there may need to be something in secondary legislation that clearly defines what might be within that public interest, given the changing scene of other pieces of legislation, to make sure that stakeholders know what's coming down the road, if you like, whether it's proportionate and actually addresses what this bill is supposed to achieve.
I think whether it's in secondary legislation, Convener, or whether it's actually defined in the code, I think we're quite relaxed about. But it is important for all those people involved in deer management that we can clearly define those circumstances where we will intervene in the public interest, that's collectively understood, clearly defined and articulated and well evidenced.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is the Code of Practice is obviously going to play a critical role in this. It's almost like a framework bill, and the Code of Practice then puts the meat on the bones. So should that Code of Practice undergo more scrutiny from the Parliament and not just be left to Nature Scott to pull together, whether that's co-design or whatever? Does there need to be an oversight from the Parliament of the Code of Practice?
Well, I think, again, we're quite relaxed about that, in the fact that there are some proposed changes to the frequency within which we review the code, and it sets out the process for how that would operate in practice. Again, I think the most important thing from our perspective as a regulator is to make sure that the sector are cited and involved in development of the code, that's clearly understood and articulated, because that actually provides quite a significant basis on which we will intervene.
Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Good morning. Really interesting discussion there, because I think that's part of the problem with these framework bills, isn't it? Is that these aren't defined. So actually the stakeholders don't really know what's going on. So can I ask a few questions around the Code of Practice? Because this actually, I think, will be instrumental in helping everyone to understand what this bill will actually do. I'll start with Section 12 of the bill, changes when Nature Stock can review compliance with and effectiveness of the Code of Practice. How will you decide when it is an appropriate time to carry out a review of that?
So I think the easiest answer to that, Tim, is that we will inevitably need to take out a review very, very quickly in terms of being able to reflect the range of circumstances by which Nature Scott would intervene as set out within these provisions. Again, traditionally it's been quite straightforward for us to be able to articulate the things that you must do within the code, because it's a legal requirement. The things that you should do within the code, because if you don't, it exposes you to the risk of regulation and intervention. And those are currently articulated based on the existing provisions. And also those things that you could do, because we consider it to be best practice. That is a tried and tested formula, which I think the industry understand, and we are quite comfortable provides, I suppose, a range of options whereby we might ratchet up our intervention, and it's the second point I think is the most important aspect of that, to help develop and articulate and put the colour and substance on those types of situations where Nature Scott may actually look to introduce Section 6, 7, 8 and 10, the regulated aspects of the bill. And again, I think the simplest way to do that in the code is to use examples and a range of circumstances whereby actually, if we take the view that voluntary mechanisms are not currently delivering on the public interest as clearly defined in a geography, that could be, I don't know, river basin management planning, riparian restoration, it could be peatland restoration, there could be a range of different circumstances, all of which probably constitute aspects of the public interest. We would want to be able to articulate those and express those in a range of circumstances. Donald, do you want to add to that?
I think just in terms of the review, so in terms of the current legislation, the review was looking at on a three-yearly period, which is quite prescriptive in that it's quite a short timescale actually in terms of some of the changes that we're looking at. So the change within the bill as presented is to provide a little bit more flexibility around that and a time for bedding in of some of that changes that are taking place in the code, because the code will have to go through a fairly fundamental review to look at the new provisions that come through in the bill. That provides that time to do that and to have that review, but it allows a bit of flexibility there in doing that so that we're not constantly reviewing. There's obviously a need for the checks and balances there to make sure that the code is fit for purpose in that time frame, but it provides that flexibility in terms of the prescriptive nature of that.
I think if I may just follow up as well, obviously if there are aspects or if there are parts of the sector that are not comfortable with the clarity provided in the code, that in itself might provide a mechanism or a trigger for us to say, okay, well, we need to be able to express that more clearly because there is a lack of understanding. But hopefully we would avoid those circumstances, Tim, by ensuring that there was co-production of the code from the outset of each time we reviewed it.
And can I ask, what's Nature Scott's relationship with the code? And I ask that because my understanding is in the 96 Act, you had to have regard to the Code of Practice. Now, there's some, I think I'm not quite clear now, because in some parts I think that have regard to is gone, but I think in Section 5 it remains. But actually that's not particularly strong, is it? So actually that's a finding, you kind of have to have regard to it, but it doesn't really matter. But in your mind, will Nature Scott clearly work to the code that is produced?
So, again, taking a couple of steps back, the code is still relatively new in terms of it wasn't developed in the 1996 Act. It was developed later on, and it's an attempt again to provide clarity and guide behaviours for those deer managers that we need to take into account of it. Whilst we do as well, it was very much driven by trying to direct behaviours of deer management practitioners about what they can, should and must do, and in exercising our functions, we would obviously want to take that into account. That in principle will still apply regardless of how it's prescribed in primary legislation, because we want to use that code as a means by which we can clearly set out the circumstances where we would be applying regulation.
But I mean, I looked it up. So I've got here case law from 2014 notes that to have regard to a matter means simply that that matter must be specifically considered, not that it must be given greater weight than other matters. So I guess when some of the stakeholders are coming to me and saying, I don't know what Nature's Scot are really going to do with this code of practice. So I think they need that explicit knowledge that everything you write in here will be built with them as well, but actually that will be what you follow as well.
So I think the code is obviously setting out the intervention that we have from a regulatory perspective, and of course we have regulatory duties in terms of discharging our functions, and having regard to the code within the legislation is one part of that. But in being clear about how we implement our regulatory functions, the code is a key part for us in terms of discharging that and making sure that we are setting that out and being following the principles of better regulation there in setting out when we will act and how we will act and what basis we will act. That code is key to that.
One more very quick question, if I can. Just, do you think then it would be better in the primary legislation to have regard to comply with, because that might give certainty to stakeholders? And also, I guess the big thing, and Finlay Carson, the convener, picked up on this. Do you think actually it would have been better if actually the code had come along with the sort of bill? Because actually the framework nature of the bill means we don't really know what we're talking about here. Do you think there could have been a draft that could have been produced along with the bill?
So again, I think taking a couple of steps back, the primary purpose of the Code of Practice of Deer Management is aimed at deer practitioners. It's for them, it's to help them understand how they can deliver sustainable deer management in Scotland. And as I said, it is structured in a way which is trying to ensure that they understand the legal requirements, the things that they could do to avoid the prospect of regulation, and the things they should do because it's best practice. That's reasonably well understood under the current provisions, and I think where there is a need to look at, again afresh at it, are based on the new provisions where there are interventions under 6 ZB about enhancement and restoration, because that's new, Tim, and that does require some time to work through that and to provide hopefully reassurance to everybody that that's well articulated and well understood.
Just before we move away from the code, now, we know that the Code of Practice has got to be approved by Parliament, but the work on pulling that code together in terms of working with stakeholders has not yet begun. Would it not be desirable for a draft of that code of practice to be available prior to stage 3 of these proceedings, just so we know what it's likely to look like, but it also then allows stakeholders to know what's coming down the road? Because we've seen other situations where framework bills have required a code of practice, and it's been quite some time before that code of practice has actually been approved, and it sometimes has been quite difficult. Looking at hunting with dogs, some of the wildlife Muirburn bill, code of practice, even definitions within the agriculture bill. So would it not be sensible for that work on producing that code of practice to start now, and for the Parliament to be able to see what that's going to look like in draft form prior to the bill going through?
I think in response, Convener, there is a slight difference in this specific circumstances compared to Sustainable Agricultural Code or other codes of practice, because we already have a code of deer management which is well articulated and understood, and whilst we're happy to reflect on that, I don't suspect there will be a significant change to the structure of how the Code of Deer Management actually works in practice. It's much more about updating it and refining it and doing that to help articulate these new provisions and how they're expressed. So whilst I don't think we're opposed in principle to continue to start that conversation, I think actually it may well be limited by capacity.
Okay, so it's not something that you're considering starting work on, so we can give some reassurance to the stakeholders and land managers at the moment, no?
We can start those informal discussions. Indeed, we already are, but it's not with the express intention to progress the two things in parallel, convener. But happy to reflect on that as the bill progresses through each stage.
Was it there was not a precedent set with the Wildlife Muirburn bill? Was there not the code of practice that started being built up prior to that piece of legislation being concluded? So it's not unusual.
No, I mean we can start that process. The code was not developed in advance of the legislation, the bill going through and becoming on that. The process had started in that, so there was so there was stakeholder engagement in that process, but there was no finality to that by the time the bill had progressed.
Okay, thank you. A question from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Section 13 adds nature restoration as a reason for intervention in deer management, but control schemes under Section 8 powers of the 1996 Act have not been used until quite recently. So I wonder if the new powers in the bill change your approach to intervention, and should we include in the bill things that you must intervene on?
Okay, so again, I think it's just useful to remind ourselves that this bill and some of the provisions are trying to ensure that NatureScot, as the regulator, is able to intervene proactively to begin to try and preempt problems before they arise. And one of the potential limitations of the existing legislation is the reactive. It's responding to concerns about damage and trying to prevent damage. It doesn't allow us to get on the front foot and start thinking about deer management planning in areas where we would like to see enhancement and restoration. Indeed, some of the provisions historically have prevented us from doing that. So this is an attempt to make sure that we are equipped, forward-looking, and able to put in place deer management provisions to enhance nature rather than to respond to concerns about damage. So from our perspective, that's a very positive change. How that plays out in practice, I suspect, will introduce a degree of complexity whereby we have got an area of land, a control area, and there is, I don't know, maybe mixed appetite to be able to respond to some of the deer management provisions which are expressed, and I suspect will lead to maybe more common interventions where Section 8 is more readily used, because it is an exception at the moment. We haven't used it in very many circumstances. Indeed, it's only recently passed that ministers have signed off Section 8 control schemes for the first time in Scotland. And some of that is symptomatic of the fact that it requires quite clear deterioration from a baseline, and some of the habitats that we've been looking at have already been at a reasonably low environmental quality. And indeed, I think as a result, if we are serious about realising our aims for restoring and enhancing nature by 2030 and 2045, Section 8 perhaps could become more commonplace.
I think just to come in on that as well, I think Section 8 is almost the end of a process, and that there's been a failure in that process to get to that point, because that's in at one end of the regulatory piece. Whereas as I said earlier, voluntary approach, ratcheting up into looking for management plans to be in place, looking for voluntary control agreements to be in place, then you get into the control scheme area. So it's about Section 8 is at one end of that. But the whole process is to make sure that the enhancement and restoration piece is seen in the context, in a similar context to the damage piece that we've got just now, in that it's changing that focus and efforts around deer management to make sure that there is those abilities there, to make sure that we can have those proactive discussions around some of those areas, to make sure that we're getting that enhancement and restoration that's required.
So the new powers would be used earlier, is that what you're saying? Or is it at the same period, but your intervention wouldn't be so dependent on gathering information about kind of degradation of the area, it would be to actually take it from the current base and increase it rather than bring it back to a state it had once been.
There's a number of provisions within the bill which kind of streamlines to an extent the process in terms of moving through the Section 678 process to make sure there aren't unnecessary barriers there. There are appropriate checks and balances in the process there to make sure that we are, as a regulator, responsible for that. But there is some streamlining of that in a sense. But yes, the evidence base around some of that is clearer. Or can be clearer in some of that, particularly if that's set out in clear terms within the code that we talked about earlier.
So can you give us some examples of where you would now intervene, where you would intervene under the bill rather than what would have happened previously? And also let us know whether we should be putting in the bill circumstances where you must intervene.
So, I mean, again, I think taking a step back and looking backwards, we have exercise powers under Section 6 and under Section 7 over the last 20 years, predominantly on areas of designated sites where nature objectives are quite clearly expressed. And whilst deer management arrangements have not been restricted just to those areas, because as you know, we have to look at what would constitute a sensible control area. That's been the trigger for intervention. Increasingly, when we think about public interest, maybe being expressed in carbon terms or water catchment terms or water quality, we might be looking at catchments that are not designated for natural.
Why do you always worry that?
Natural heritage specifically, but there is quite clearly a need to make sure herbivore pressures are not preventing establishment of woodlands or restoration of peatlands where the drivers may not be designated sites. And I think looking at those catchments is probably relatively new for us, but quite clearly based on the way these provisions are written, we would be expressing our desire for deer management planning to be much more effective in some of those areas. And of course, as Donald's articulated, that could begin to change the nature of our relationships, where it's a much more formal. We would like.
I'll put it on.
We'd like to see a deer management plan in this area being applied. And ideally, the owners come together, facilitate a deer management plan which largely satisfies any concerns about whether or not herbivore pressures are going to prevent establishment or restoration of habitats. And if we need additional assurance, then we might look to underpin that with a Section 7 control agreement, which again is voluntary, but provides a degree of formality and a relationship between NatureScot as the regulator and the owner-occupiers of that land, that we've got the process in place to check on an annual basis that progress is being made. And where we haven't been able to secure agreement, either on an individual or collective basis, we would find ourselves in circumstances where a control scheme might be applicable, where there is less room for negotiation, but we remain quite clear in the view of the deer management measures necessary, either to prevent damage or indeed to restore and enhance the habitats in question. Does that help explain how it might work in practice?
Yes, but it doesn't answer my final question, which was about should we be putting in the bill examples of when you need to act. So I suppose, for example, if one landowner complains that their efforts at nature restoration are being hampered by another landowner, would you then react maybe on wild salmon? If you felt that rivers were not being maintained properly, should we be putting in the bill that you would need to act in those circumstances?
So on the specific provisions of when we might interact, some of those circumstances are articulated more clearly than others, and I think most of the concern is actually about the new provisions about responding to the need to restore and enhance nature, because that could take a variety of forms. Comes back to how we articulate and express that. Our expectations that will be much more clearly articulated in the code of practice rather than the face of primary legislation.
Tim Eagle, then Emma Roddick.
I've got to clip my little flock of sheep soon, and a bit like that, this all seems just a little bit woolly for me. So I think it's just clarity, isn't it? It's understanding. So you mentioned earlier on, I think, about case studies in the code of practice. So are you giving that guarantee? Because actually, what does restoration mean for one holding, the holding next to it, et cetera, et cetera? So you will put not just case studies, but clear guidance within the code of practice and work with the sector to make sure we know what that means.
Yeah, I think it's the clarity there about making sure that public interest that we're delivering has a high-level strategic nature to it, in terms of that's been signed off by Minister's government, in terms of policies that is doing at a national scale, at a regional scale, and looking at that in the locality, so that there is a clear line of sight there, almost in terms of where that public interest has been derived from and what we're trying to achieve there. I think I'm going back a little bit to the question over there, just about making sure that how prescriptive can we be in that is slightly difficult. In that deer management is usually, and it's quite often, a significant factor in the delivery of the environmental benefits that we're looking at. It might not be the only factor in that too, that we've got to look at, invasive non-natives or other aspects of that. So we have to look at that and around a bit more of a holistic approach to what we're trying to achieve in these areas and how we're doing it. But where there is that deer management need, then that's clearly articulated and set out. And the code, we've talked about the code doing that in terms of setting that out from a very strategic nature right down to looking at how that would be applied in practice.
Okay. I should have said, I think criteria is also very important within that code, isn't it? Are you aware of the financial memorandum and how it lays out how many times you expect to use these new powers under nature restoration?
Yes, we contribute to the financial memorandum.
How did you come to that out of interest? Like what made you, because I've got it written down, 3 to 5 deer management plan, 9 voluntary control agreements, 1 to 2 control schemes. How did you come to those figures?
So they're based in historic look at how we've tried to apply our current regulatory powers in terms of damage. And we're looking at that in terms of, well, what are we resourced to do it to an extent, in terms of looking at in line with the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, which is one of the drivers of looking at what we're trying to achieve here, and trying to make sure that we've got a programme of work essentially that fits with the resources that might be available to us, and the scale that we're trying to influence and change for 2030 and 2045 targets. So we've looked at that on the basis of, well, what's the work programme almost that we could look to deliver on that. Now, whether we get to Section 8, in terms of, it's all dependent on the nature of that case-by-case work that we're doing, and how much engagement and how proactive people are in doing that. But as an example, we've put out there that those are the levels, the kind of maximum levels that we'd be looking up to in terms of resource that's available.
And just finally, very quickly, do you then already have, to come to those sort of figures, I presume you've already had some quite detailed work in the background. So, is that something you can release then? Like, if you've got a set of criteria, draft criterias, or draft something that could be released, so that we have an understanding of how you're coming to these figures in the financial memorandum?
Yeah, we've based the figures on information that we've looked at. Slightly hypothetical in terms of the areas that we might be focusing on, but in broad terms, looking at the costs in terms of how we implement and do our current regulation. But we can provide some information.
So in that case, it's not important that criteria is actually on the face of the bill, or far more clearly set out. If you're able to estimate and put together something in the financial memorandum, it must be fairly robust. If that was available to stakeholders, that would make it far clearer what limitations they're working within.
I think in response to that point and Tim's point, it's actually we can't regulate the system everywhere. That's not the way the system works in Scotland. It's a voluntary system of deer management, and we are only really looking to intervene in those cases where the voluntary system begins to break down. We've got experience of that over, Donald and I, 25 years of implementing deer legislation in Scotland, and based on existing criteria set out in those existing provisions. But having a forward look about what the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy is expecting in terms of deer management, about understanding the need for landscape scale restorations in certain parts of the country, about understanding SEPA's desire for more effective river basin management planning, we do expect.
So you talk about landscape scale. How's that going to work on a voluntary basis when you might get some people opting in and opting out? Will that increase the number of times you're going to have to statutory enforce deer numbers rather than voluntary? And has that been taken into consideration?
Well, that's kind of how it works already, Convener, in the fact that we've got a number of Section 7 control agreements over fairly significant areas of land where we might have 12, 13, 14 estates all signed up to voluntary control agreements. And in terms of how we regulate that, it's negotiated and it's negotiable. And actually, that's still our preference to work within the voluntary system. It's only when the voluntary system breaks down, which still tends to be the exception, that we might be looking to use Section 8 as a means to deliver some of the restoration as expressed, and perhaps spatially explicit through other plans and strategies. And I think that's the difficulty of putting that prescription on the face of the bill, because the Scottish Forest Strategy or other things will have targets in themselves, and some of that will be spatially expressed, and it's difficult to translate that into primary legislation for deer.
Okay. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to pick up on Rhoda Grant's line of questioning there, because I think there were some interesting points raised around where there should be a duty to intervene or a trigger for your intervention, and I'm not clear on the position on whether that should be the case. But I think this is going to be an area that the committee is going to have to look into in detail, so it'd be good just to hear a little bit more about your position on that.
So again, taking a step back, fundamentally the responsibilities for delivering sustainable deer management rest with owner occupiers. Those people that have got the rights to take deer have got, with a certain amount of responsibility to ensure effective deer management is taking place. That's what the Code of Practice continues to set out in a variety of levels. I suppose the question is about at what point within this legislation puts additional duties on NatureScot to regulate the system under certain circumstances. I'm not entirely sure what more I can offer other than look at what's been drafted here, which sets out the types of circumstances where NatureScot may regulate rather than will or should. But again, I hate to come back to it, we would hope to be able to express that more clearly within the code of practice. But again, maybe that's something the committee wants to take some further evidence on. Donald, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I mean, the underlying point here is about the change of kind of approach and behaviour towards delivering for biodiversity and climate principally, but the measures around deer management for making sure that we've got enhancement and restoration. But being prescriptive about adding NatureScot must act in these circumstances may not, it potentially opens that up to being undeliverable in terms of having to act in too many circumstances where we're not resourced to do that. But what I think what we're looking to do through the code and setting that out is saying that, look, there's a prioritisation process here where we're going to, because we can't do everything everywhere. The scale of deer management issues throughout Scotland are vast and significant, but we need to have a kind of planned and prioritised approach to that. And I think it's the structure around that that's important to make sure that there is clarity with stakeholders about where and when we will intervene. But as much information as possible in terms of how we see that as being a prioritised approach, aligning with other government or the significant government or public interest policies that are out there.
As much as my brain's catching up with the questions here, I do think again there's a fundamental question here about the voluntary system in Scotland. It is a voluntary system, and we only intervene where that voluntary system is failing. But we can't apply regulation everywhere. So I do think that's why we need to be quite judicious about interpreting where and when we're going to intervene, because we are limited by the resources that we have to regulate a voluntary system.
So if there would be a resourcing issue, if there were a duty to intervene, does it not follow that there's a resourcing issue with when you feel you should intervene?
So again, I think we have a degree of discretion where there are circumstances where NatureScot should intervene rather than where we must. And if the face of this bill suggests that we would have to intervene in certain circumstances, that's a significant shift, I would have thought, in terms of how we would resource the system.
Okay, thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, pursuing that kind of line of questioning, I'm really interested in the reasons why that Section 8 power has been used so infrequently over the decades. It feels like it's almost been a redundant power. It is part of the reason there that there's an inbuilt fear of judicial review within NatureScot and SNH. To go back to Roddick's point around resourcing, if you're going to use that option of a Section 8 power, someone's going to challenge it and you need deep pockets.
I think fundamentally the answer to that question is no, Mark. There's no fear of judicial review within NatureScot. The legislation as drafted has a process which allows appeal and challenge, and more than happy to continue to test that, because by doing that will we understand and learn whether the prescription is right and whether our approach has been right. I think some of the concerns about Section 8 is about we have always needed to be clear about expressing damage. And sometimes that's been quite a difficult thing to do on the face of robust scrutiny about how that's evidenced. As I mentioned earlier, about where actually the starting point for quite a lot of these schemes is a relatively low baseline in terms of condition. Very difficult to show deterioration from condition where actually it's not in great shape to start with. And I think,
I mean, thinking back to examples of that over the years, would you say that was the case with the Ardvarr estate a number of years ago, where there was real questions as to why NatureScot at the time was not using Section 8 powers to intervene? Is it because it was so deteriorated it was difficult to prove, or?
Well, again, just to be fair, there probably was a case for intervention in Ardvarr, and we were certainly satisfied actually we'd failed to reach agreement, but obviously Section 8 control schemes are signed off by ministers and requires ministerial appetite to regulate the system.
Okay, so would you expect as a result of this bill there to be potentially more or less risk of judicial review? Or do you think there's enough certainty within the bill and there'll be enough certainty coming out of the Code of Practice that everybody will know where they stand on this? And it'll be quite clear that a Section 8 order is a Section 8 order. And
that's certainly our aspiration, Mark, and the bill and the changes that it's making is putting the deer regulation on a modern front foot, clearly articulated, intervention powers clearly expressed, reinforced and understood through the Code of Practice, and the mechanisms by which Section 8 would actually work and be challenged are modern and fit for purpose, because having just gone through the process, there are inevitably still hiccups within the existing system which we'd like to see changed, and this bill provides the mechanisms to do that.
In the judicial review, but judicial review is around the challenge to Nature Scots processes in delivering through on the regulation on the delivery of the legislation. So as long as our processes are in place, then that risk of judicial review is reduced or lessened or negated in that respect. Some of the challenge that we have is making sure that the kind of test and the point that we've got to satisfy ourselves of in the legislation is where some of the challenge would come from our perspective, making sure that we're satisfied in that. The actual process of delivering that is down to us making sure that our processes are in place and not challengeable.
Okay, so just to go back to the example then this month of a Section 8 order actually being issued, I think you said in your comms that you can't be satisfied that effective deer management will be put in place to address risk of significant impact on peatlands, woodlands and other habitats. What does the new Section 6.7b then add to that? Because 6.7b is about restoration. Does that really change the nature of your consideration of the Section 8 powers? Because it seems like you're already acting on an example of where there's deterioration but also an urgent need for restoration. So I'm struggling to understand how 6.7b really adds anything significantly to that, but maybe you can explain.
Well, maybe have a first cut and then let Donald follow up. So circumstances in East Sutherland is that we have got a range of designated sites that are negatively impacted by deer and are suffering damage as a result. There was consensus amongst the local deer management group that needed addressed in the deer management plan, and we've got an individual estate who's not part of that and not willing to sign up to a local deer management plan, and we were unable to secure voluntary agreement on that basis, hence the need to ratchet up the regulatory intervention and use a control scheme to ensure that deer management provisions were in place to address concerns of damage on designated sites and designated features. I suppose the difference in terms of 6.8b is circumstances where it's less about dealing with damage and much more where there is an express desire to restore and enhance over and above concerns about damage. And I think that's quite an important distinction to make, because we've never really had the opportunity to think about where we'd like to see intervention to restore and enhance nature, to deliver for nature and climate outcomes in a way which is more about those positive outcomes rather than reactive concerns about damage and things going backwards. And that is an important distinction to make. So that's the value we see in these new provisions.
Okay. Wouldn't it just be easier though just to say deterioration, restoration, it's all part of the same picture? What we need is deer management, nature restoration orders, and then that just encapsulates the whole thing, rather than having a quite outdated system based on preserving remnants of biodiversity and then trying to bolt on something that's more about restoration and improvement. It feels quite confused.
I think there is two parts to that, and I think the two parts are quite important in terms of as set out that the nature of deer management and the issue that we've got is pretty extensive throughout Scotland, but a significant issue. So we are trying to make sure that we kind of get a baseline of effective and sustainable deer management across Scotland, and that preventing damage piece allows us to do that in a fairly clear and consistent way across Scotland in looking at the different habitats and purposes that we are looking to achieve in that. The second part of that is where we're looking to deliver that enhancement or restoration on a more specific basis, because we can't do that everywhere, but we are working at both ends of those spectrums to make sure that we are getting the best that we need for our biodiversity and climate on a localised or regional basis, but we are also working at that national level and that public, and that prevention of damage aspect is really important in that, to make sure that we get that consistency across Scotland.
Okay, thanks.
Just very briefly in a technical situation when we're talking about Section 8. The bill suggests that a control scheme will be registered to the title of land. If that title was to change hands, should there not be something within the bill that would allow that control system to change back to a control agreement? Would that not be more reasonable, given that the new owners may be willing to put into place voluntary measures to control deer? Is that something we need to be aware of?
So an interesting question, Convener, and again, how that would work in practice. I mean, the basic premise is that we want to ensure that control schemes persist, or that deer management measures persist regardless of changing ownership, and it's important that does remain the case. Now, how that would work in practice is that whether deer management provisions are carried out voluntarily or indeed as part of a control scheme, I don't think would make a lot of material difference. If a new owner was coming in and quite comfortable to apply the deer management provisions within a control scheme, it would make very little difference to them. Actually, the risk is that they weren't able to deliver on those provisions, and actually Nature Scott would have to undertake the deer management arrangements and subsequently charge the owner would be the issue. But if a new owner came in and was comfortable with the conditions of a scheme, I don't think it would make a lot of practical difference.
Maybe not practical difference, but surely a legal obligation under a control scheme is quite burdensome. And if a voluntary agreement can be made between Nature Scott and a new owner, that would be surely more proportionate.
And I suspect is absolutely negotiable, because as part of the control scheme we're reviewing on an annual basis, and we might reach the view that in that location and with that owner that a control scheme is no longer appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Donald, did you want to?
I think the point is that we are satisfied with the measures that are going to be in place. If we could be satisfied with the measures in place, then that might negate the need for a continuance of the Section 8 control scheme.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you. I know you've touched a little bit about the criteria for managing deer, and I'm just looking at different things here. You know, there's different species of deer occupy the same habitat, and in the Nature Scott on the web here, it talks about the Deer Working Group recommended that Nature Scott adopted 10 red deer per kilometre square as an upper benchmark, but that's in the Highlands, and we know that there's deer in the borders in Dumfries and Galloway, and there's peri-urban deer as well. So I'm seeking to understand about deer management protocols or policies needing to be flexible, because there is different habitats that are occupied, farmland that is affected, so that's about damage to property rather than restoration in peatland areas, for instance, right? So I'm seeking to understand about how there needs to be flexibility on the bill, which then means that guidance can then be created that would work for the diverse habitat areas that need to be, protected and restored. Is that correct?
I think it is, yeah. There's no mention of specific density thresholds within this bill. I mean, I think it's incumbent on Nature Scott to take into account the size and density of deer populations in discharging our functions. And as you've rightly said, in different parts of the country, those densities will be different, the species will be different, and the impacts will be different. And I think it's important the committee understand and recognise that, because it is not a one-size-fits-all here, but what we need this regulation and this legislation to do is provide the flexibility for intervention based on different circumstances. And again, come back to Mark's previous question about damage. When we're talking about agricultural issues or commercial forestry issues, the biggest concern is actually about damage, and that could be coming from a range of species at various densities, and we just need to make sure that our interventions are alive to that fact. And indeed, if we are using Section 6 or Section 7 or Section 8 or Section 10, that it's afforded the flexibility to deal with site-specific circumstances, species and impacts. And I think this legislation provides that flexibility.
Baseline data will be collected and coordinated, so I'm assuming that Nature Scotland will need to work with Forestry and Land Scotland, for instance, so that everybody is aware of how we're collecting the data and measuring or analysing like a tipping point that requires a Section 8 or, a level of damage that's been assessed. So that means partnership working in order to collect data. Is that correct as well?
Yes, so I mean, in the collection of data, there's a number of different facets to that around population, densities in localities, but also mainly around impacts around that. And as we said earlier, most of the deer management in Scotland is done on a voluntary basis by private third sector. Public sector, FLS, a significant player in that, and they take a significant proportion of the deer cull every year. So yes, there's that stakeholder working across the piece, and the evidence piece in this and the collaborative nature of that, the sharing of that is really important, and we're doing quite a lot of work there to make sure that we've got the availability for that data to be made open and transparent, so that there can be more informed and better decisions taken across land holdings and within different management groups. And we've got structures in the upland areas around deer management groups, but we equally need to get that kind of approach more apparent across other areas of Scotland.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. Looking at the limitation of criminal liability, Section 18 of the bill amends Section 14 of the 96 Act, which deals with the criminal liability exemptions for actions under a control agreement, control scheme, or Section 10 of the 96 Act. So are the distinctions between staff and non-staff criminal liability sufficiently clear under Section 18 of the bill?
Yeah, I think what the bill does again is continue to clarify in pursuit of our functions under Section 8 and Section 10 that quite clearly Nature Scot staff or contractors who are working on our behalf are protected from potential criminal liability as expressed under 3A. So I'm quite comfortable, Beatrice, that this is practical and workable and is not a significant change from ensuring whoever, whether it's Nature Scot staff or contractors that we use, operate within the law.
And how will these changes be communicated then to your third-party contractors or indeed community groups?
Well, I think, again, in circumstances whereby we are exercising powers under Section 8 or Section 10, anybody involved in the control of deer, a lot of that will be spelled out in operational plans about the nature of the intervention, about what type of deer management provisions are being executed, about how they will be discharged operationally. Because again, just coming back down to it, a lot of that practically will be about what species of deer we're shooting, when, using what methods and where. So that will largely be captured in operational plans for delivering of those functions. How they're expressed to local communities, again, I suspect will depend on the nature of the intervention and at what scale. In pursuit of control schemes, for example, there is already a mechanism whereby we alert interested parties to the fact that a control scheme is in operation and the specific management measures which are expressed in it. And if there are any concerns about that, there's a means by which people can make representation, both to us and to ministers, about any concerns they have.
Donald?
Yeah, I mean, so just to be clear, these are fairly limited and controlled circumstances where these will use. So they are highly controlled. What it does is these may be circumstances where there is an agreement on the management that's taking place that might expose our staff who are undertaking regulatory functions to potential criticism around that, which may end up in potential legal issues. This provides an element of protection for our staff in that process, but it is limited and controlled, and clearly there are exemptions within that for welfare and other aspects of it which are completely important to maintain, but it provides that legal basis for our staff to be protected around some of those difficult circumstances where we might be putting boots on the ground to affect deer culls which might not be accepted.
Okay.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next topic. Just, do you have any comment for the needs or indeed the workability around any of the proposed changes to your investigatory powers under the sections 21, 22 and 23?
I mean, so it's basically looking at, again, at streamlining that so that we've got a more effective ability to enter onto land in circumstances where we've not got that agreement to take place. So, I mean, these were Deer Working Group recommendations that looked at this, so it's looked at an external body in extent to look at how it frees, it makes better use of our how more effective regulation can take place. So we're quite comfortable with that, really, in terms of making sure that that's in place and making sure that the availability of information and data that we might require to make decisions on those regulatory processes are available to us. So we're quite comfortable with that.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Eleanor.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I'm interested in understanding what processes NatureScot use to assess an applicant's competence and fitness to be authorised, especially if we think about higher risk activities such as using shotguns or night shooting. And also, I think it'd be helpful for the committee to understand whether the bill will change this process in any meaningful way.
I'm happy to take that. So, I mean, fitness and competence is something that we deal with currently, so it's part of the process for issuing authorisations that we deal with. So there are two, and again, I think this was explained in the last session, but there's two parts. The fitness piece is around someone's ability to hold and own a firearm, and then the competence piece is generally about the practice, about being able to do that safely and effectively, looking at the various different, public safety, food safety aspects of it, and to do that competently. So that's the two bits that we look at there. And we apply that now in terms of looking at those authorisations that we issue. What the bill does is look to set that out in terms of looking at setting a kind of base standard for that for deer management across Scotland, which I think we are supportive of that in terms of demonstrating that deer management is done effectively, and there's a public confidence in that is important to make sure that the public are confident that we are able to those managing and killing deer are doing that competently. And then there's additional aspects of that which is linked to the other pieces in here about out of season control or night shooting, where we might look to put in additional aspects of training or requirements to make sure that that is done on a competent basis. So what the bill does is it allows us to look at that again in terms of competence and making sure that is fit for purpose in terms of modernising the different approaches that are available in Scotland now to use of technology for some of the management techniques that we've got. So making sure that we've got the checks and balance in there that provides that public and political confidence.
And if we think about Scotland as a whole in different areas, my colleague Emma Harper's already touched on that before, do we think that we have the necessary skills spread across the whole of Scotland in terms of people who possess those skills that we're looking for in terms of being able to do those activities? Or does NatureScot believe that there's perhaps an area for how we actually help to train up and to provide assistance to people to get that level of competence?
So, I mean, we do have a significant resource in Scotland of people who are able to undertake effective deer management and culling. I think in delivering this approach around fit and competent, what we do not want to do is introduce unnecessary barriers there to make sure that we are not putting barriers in place. Clearly, we need to make sure that there is that public safety is at the heart of what we do, and we're not reducing standards in that, but we need to make sure that there isn't unnecessary barriers there to make sure that is the case. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we have for deer management is just making sure that we do have that continued resource coming through, and we will need that to affect the increased culls that we're looking at. I think aligned with other agricultural and land use sectors, we've got quite a senior aged population who are involved in doing this management, and what we need to make sure is that we do have a kind of flow of people coming into the industry around deer management to make sure that we do have that resource maintained in the long term. But I don't think that the competence element is a barrier to doing that. It's inherent in most of the land management spheres now that we do have competence and training to do that. But it's important that we get that resource maintained and that there is an element of support there for that to take place.
I guess, I was just going to say my kind of issue that I'm trying to explore a little bit is perhaps if we think about lowland deer management and we think about the fact that you have a lot of people who will be asking permission as in a hobby kind of capacity to go out on land and help a landowner to manage deer, and the costs associated with that person getting to that level of competence can be quite prohibitive. So perhaps not thinking about larger estates in a more highland setting, thinking specifically maybe about lowland settings.
I think just in response, it's important again to remind committee that we have got a wealth of skills and experience deer management practitioners in Scotland, and whilst that is the case, there is no requirement in law just now for anybody to have demonstrated their competence to go out and shoot deer. This is introducing a basic requirement of competence for anybody, carrying a firearms to go out and demonstrate that they're able to shoot deer safely, humanely, with the highest regard to deer welfare, food standards, and firearm safety. That applies to anybody who wants to shoot deer in Scotland. I actually think is a really sensible step to demonstrating confidence, actually, that deer management in Scotland is progressive, is operating to certain standards, and actually is much more aligned with what happens in lots of other European countries where there is a basic level of competence for anybody who wants to shoot deer. I think that's meaningful progress. I think there is a concern about that being a barrier to entrance, but in actual fact, when you look at the vast majority of vocational and recreational stalkers in Scotland who are all operating to excellent standards, most of them have already undertaken voluntary qualifications in order to be able to demonstrate that very point. So hopefully that dispels any concern that this is a barrier to deer management. But over and above that, where people are wanting to shoot deer out of season or at night, we already assess those individuals' level of competence, and we will need to reflect about how that happens and whether that provides opportunities again to ensure highest standards are being applied, and by doing so it allows us to potentially deregulate the system to allow those individuals who've got the skills and got the knowledge to be able to exercise those functions without recourse to come into NatureScot for a specific authorisation where they're already satisfied and have demonstrated they've got the skills and capacities to shoot deer safely and humanely with all active considerations to ecology and welfare.
Thank you.
Can I just, for clarification, will the authorisation be linked to properties or individuals, or will the ability be there to do to both?
The ability will be there to do both in terms of the bill. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Tim Eagle.
Yeah, just to carry on from that, if that's all right. So Section 28 of the bill allows people to register as authorised to carry out activities that require authorisation from NatureScot. In what cases would one-off authorisations outside the register be granted?
So the suggestion is that activities, for example, driving deer with vehicles or shooting deer within the closed season, will still require specific authorisation from NatureScot. So again, it's expressed under certain circumstances whereby once you're on the fit and competence register, you are able to shoot deer in Scotland. If you want to shoot deer, for example, at night, we would expect a slightly different degree of competence to be able to evidence and demonstrate that you can do that competently in line with what we already assess. That provides flexibility for those practitioners to make decisions about at what point during the day they want to shoot deer, in much the way the same they do when they're controlling foxes or other things at night. But there remains a degree of, there remains a requirement for specific authorisations to be applied by NatureScot for certain activities, and those certain activities tend to be the exception, which are not normal and commonplace.
Okay. That's fine. Can I just then go back to you, because I think Alina Witham's question there I thought was really good, because in the lowland context, we talk a lot about the upland context, we don't talk enough about the lowland context, which is much more problematic, I think. But if what we want to achieve is the reduction of deer numbers effectively for nature restoration, whatever it would be, we don't want barriers. So have you thought about, in terms of the fit and competence element, like some sort of what have I written down, a referee scheme or a grandfather rights type scheme that at least in the interim could help to help the sector to officiate one another until they can get whatever is official? I don't know, do you know what that official thing will be?
No, so I think there's a bit of work, and we would want to develop that with the industry to make sure that we get that standards right for that. But in terms of the point there, I mean, those things are on the table. We have done that in the past. When we introduced fit and competence around that and the requirements for us, for a level of confidence there, we did have almost that grandfather rights where we did allow people to cite, to have that. Basically demonstrate, go to others to demonstrate that they have that competence there, as well as official qualifications. But I think that